Okay, welcome everybody. Today is another webinar series where we talk today about the implications of the COVID crisis on the economy. We're very happy to have Olivier Blanchard with us, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and former chief economist of the IMF. He will talk today about mostly the fiscal implications, the short run and long run implications. Before we go to Olivier, I would like to give you some background what we did last week and a little bit of a preview of what's coming up in the next few webinars. So one of the striking features of Paul Romer's webinar was the figure he showed. If you look at the jobless claims in the United States, how does it compare to 2008, 2009? And if you look at this figure, it's really striking how much more dramatic the jobless claims have risen compared to 2008, 2009. It's a much more dramatic rise. Second thing he really emphasized is to really focus on R0, and we have to bring it down not to 0 but to 1, and he had a little testing model arguing that we have to test, test, and test in order to improve the situation and slowly then open up the economy again. So we have more speakers coming up on Friday. Tyler Cohen will speak, so we have always Mondays and Fridays on more the implications on a liberal society of the current outcomes. Then Agnes Deaton will relate it to the death and despair phenomena. What are the implications for that? We're very happy to have Penny Goldberg coming, who talks about supply chains and trade after COVID. That's a very important topic. Hyun Shin, as I mentioned last time, will talk about the capital flows, and Joe Stiglitz is also in the lineup to come later on. So let me just mention a few things about fiscal policy, the topic we cover today. It's mostly, fiscal expenditures on the health crisis. We have an economic, and a financial crisis, as we talked earlier. And monetary policy is already in negative territories in many countries, so we cannot do much on the negative side. And the exchange rate, which typically helps emerging economies to depreciate to some degree to stimulate exports, is not helping much either, because now, because of the lockdown across the globe, essentially, there's a lack of demand from any country, and weakening your currency will not help in any case, and you can't weaken all of the currencies. Then the focus is therefore on fiscal policy, and of course the fiscal situation is not so good because the tax revenue is collapsing and the government expenditures are skyrocketing. And the key question we would like to address today as well, what will happen to the interest rate? And as we have much more government debt coming up, what will be the implications for the interest rate and hence implications for the long run? And the way one could see it, the fiscal policy and the interest rate, an interest rate cut during a times of a shift from a risk on to risk off regime has different implications depending which country you are in. If you are country like the United States or Germany, which can issue some safe assets, but then it is actually not so dramatic that that you have to issue so much, because the interest rate is not coming down because everybody will fly into safety. So there are a lot of capital flows going from emerging countries to flight to safety countries which can issue some safe asset. On the other hand, if you're in emerging economies or economies which cannot issue, the government is not a safe asset, then actually your interest rate might go up significantly. And the question is how to deal with that. And that actually will widen the big divide between these two types of countries more dramatically. And the question is, what should we do in order to control this divide and not make it wider? So first of all, you have to, of course, will ask, what is a safe asset? And I worked a lot with Yuli Sannikov on that. A safe asset has typically two characteristics. It has a good friend analogy characteristics and a safe asset tautology aspect to it. So a safe asset is not a risk-free asset. Think of gold, it's not risk-free, but it typically appreciates in times of crisis. So it's available and liquid when you need it, like a good friend when you need him. The other aspect of a safe asset is that it's safe because it's perceived to be safe. So because others think it's safe, they rush into the safe asset, and that makes the asset safe. It allows the country to go into debt, finance some hardship much more cheaply, and that makes the whole situation more safe. There's a multiple equilibrium story or a bubble feature coming up in this dimension. So the safe asset tautology, you can also see if you compare countries like Switzerland and Sweden, which in many dimensions are similar, but one, when there's a crisis, appreciates in value, the other one depreciates in value. So there is a multiple equilibrium or bubble component to it. So this raises the question, what should we do with the safe asset for emerging economies? I have worked earlier on a clause piece, which is essentially an S-piece idea, some European safe bond idea. You can actually also do it at a global scale. The idea would be you pool sovereign bonds across all emerging economies, and then you issue from this pool a senior claim and a junior claim, so a senior bond and a junior bond. And in our current situation, probably junior bond has to be protected by the wealthy countries. They have to provide some guarantees in order to get the whole scheme off the ground. But this should be a way to not let the divide widen too much. So that's one of the aspects we can talk about. Of course, in the fiscal domain, there are many, many aspects, the short run, the long run. And we're very glad to have Olivier Blanchard with us, who is really an expert on many, many economic issues, including the fiscal aspects. And his experience of 7 years as chief economist at the IMF allows us to get a very rich global perspective on top of it. So Olivier, with that, I will pass it on to you, and we're very happy and glad to have you with us. So as last time, we have to change the sharing the screen, so it will take us 1 or 2 minutes to do that.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, it works very well.
Very good. So we're ready to go?
We're ready to go.
Good. Okay.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Markus. I will address briefly the issue that you mentioned at the end of my towards the end of my talk. Well, first, it's very nice to speak to this very large audience, although I don't see any of you. I tried to think about fiscal policy in general. It's more encyclopedic than the short presentation that Markus gave. I hope it's useful. It's going to cover a lot of things that you actually already know, but it's trying to be synthetic and push a number of ideas that I think should be discussed. So this first slide makes 4 points, which I think are worth making. The first one is that as economists, we're basically playing second fiddle to the virologist or the epidemiologist. What we say depends, and what we should recommend depends entirely on the dynamics of a pandemic. And we're learning every day, and that's everything we say is conditional on the way it's going. That's fairly obvious. The second point is that for reasons we understand well, the main economic tool is fiscal policy. I think there are bigger issues. The role of the state versus markets will have to be revisited at some point. The issue of whether we can scale up with respect to very large shocks, whether market economies are able to do this, or whether more centralized economies can do it. But I'm going to be much closer to the ground today and just leave this aside. The focus of the talk is going to be normative, which is the fiscal policy I would like to see rather than the fiscal policy that we're seeing, although in this case, I think there's not an enormous discrepancy between the two. It's rather impressive what many governments have done. And then the last one is that this is a one-man team presentation with a lot of help. In the old days, I had 200 people who were willing to help me and prepare nice graphs and figures and all that. Now I have to do it more or less myself. And that leads to limits about both the beauty of the slides and the content of the slides. Okay, I need to start, as I've argued that basically everything depends on the epidemic. I need to start with 3 slides on the epidemic. Now we're all reading everything and we all have an understanding of it, but I think there are still a few important points to make. So we now understand that there are basically 2 phases. The first one is getting the infection rate down to some acceptable level, low level, which is the phase we're in. And then the phase 2, which is keeping it down. I think with respect to phase 1, we now know where we are. And it's, as I say, it's largely baked in. I think there's some uncertainty about the timing. It varies from country to country and from state to state, but April and May look in most cases as if it's going to be the height of demand for beds, for ICU beds, and so on. I give you a figure here for the US. There's enormous heterogeneity across countries, across states of the US. There's also a lot of uncertainty about the height of this purple band, confidence band. We don't know how many people will die, but we have a much better sense of when things will start turning around. And that's what's shown by that. The numbers that I take as very likely to be right is that the peak will be April or May, depending on where, and will be down to the low infection rates by early June, and even more so by early July. That, I think, is basically done. Whatever we do fiscally is not going to change that phase. We just have to take it as given. It's going to go from dramatic to catastrophic. We understand all that. The second one is where I think there's an enormous amount of uncertainty, which is how do we keep the infection rate low? And there the trade-off is basically between the degree of lockdown and the degree of activity and the degree of infection. And on this, I don't think we know. There are some good and bad news. I mean, maybe for me, the best news is what's happening in China. And although we don't believe many of the numbers they produce, I think these numbers about traffic flows are actually quite revealing and can be trusted. They come from TomTom. And what you have, I hope you can see it, but basically you have for the days of a week, I think I went to the site yesterday or the day before, the blue line is normal traffic and the red line is actual traffic. And if you look, it's flat during weekends. People don't use their cars during weekends, but otherwise it's fairly close to where it was, which is an indication that Beijing at least has been able to return to not quite normal, but fairly close to it. And the question is, can we do the same, and by doing what? And I think that's where we as economists have a lot of work to do in helping the policymakers choose the right ranking, the right rationing. It depends enormously, and I'll come back to this, on the amount of tests that we can use. I'll come back to this because Paul Romer was discussed it in very interesting ways last time. And the evidence is, you know, it is going to be progressive. There are going to be all kinds of rankings of people. The immunized ones will be the heroes. The negative ones will have a pass to go out for a while. And the others are going to be more or less confined, and people like me will never see the light of day for months and months. There is, again, another dimension, which is a type of work, what needs to be done in person. And I think that's being redefined as the crisis goes, who can telecommute and therefore stay home. Then there's also the sectors, what are the most essential ones? Do you want to reopen schools? Do you want to reopen manufacturing? What do you do with planes, air traffic? And here, this is not quite a joke, but it's a converse analog of what economists were asked to do in World War II in choosing bombing choices. And same thing happened in Vietnam, I think, later. But I mentioned this because some people like Ken Arrow or Charlie Kindleberger tried to find the worst way of inflicting damage, or the best way of inflicting damage. And I think we're basically in the reverse process. And this is an economic question to a large extent, and I think we can help there. Anyway, this is where there is an enormous amount of uncertainty, whether it's going to last, whether we'll be back to something like normal potential at the end of the year or sometime next year. I think nobody really knows. Everything I said, that's the third slide and last slide on the epidemic, is relevant for advanced economies. Developing and emerging market countries are just a different bunch. They have a health system which is very poor, we know that. Now on the plus side, they are less connected than in big cities, except in some large African cities. They have a younger population, so maybe less exposed. Warmer weather, we still don't have much of a clue as to how much it matters, but if it matters, it will help. Very hard to impose lockdown. Over the last few days, I've been involved in a number of webinars about countries And I thought the example of Nigeria was an interesting one. At this stage, they basically have very, very few reported cases. But if you look at how they can handle what is an exponential curve, they have 0.5% bed per 1,000 people compared to 5 times this in the US. Of all the states of Nigeria, for which somebody could get data, they have a total of 169 ventilators. And as of the end of March, they had performed 600 tests. I think the implication of this is even if we help, and I'll come back to how much we can help, fiscally and otherwise, what we're going to see there is much more what the UK considered at some point and ran away from at some point as well, which is herd immunity dynamics, in which you basically have the whole population subject to the virus and many people die, but then you're more or less done, but it's an absolutely awful thing. I think this is a fair description of a pandemic of 1918. There is now a number of papers which have looked at it. The health cost, death cost was gigantic, but the economic cost was actually surprisingly small because there was, in effect, very little lockdown. So again, everything I say for the next few slides is really about advanced economies. I'll come back to emerging markets at the end. Okay. So now turn to fiscal, with apologies for having taken too long. It seems to me that the goals of fiscal policy at this stage in this crisis are absolutely obvious. So I state this as truths. The first one is infection fighting. Anything we can do to basically get the infection rate down and then keep it there. The second is because of the suddenness of the event, something which is not standard, which is disaster. Some people just find themselves without the cash to buy food. Firms find themselves bankrupt. We haven't talked much about financial institutions in that list, but it is likely that some of them will find that they are in equally desperate situation. And something has to be done there just for basic welfare reasons. Human concerns. And then there's a third, which is aggregate demand management, which in a normal recession would be the only one we would really care about. But here it's really kind of the third wheel. It is important. It will become more important. And I want to discuss it. So what I'm going to do is discuss each of them because each of them has its own characteristics, its own challenges, its own time dimension. And I think there are plenty of questions we can work on, questions which will be solved over time. And these are worth discussing. Okay, so infection fighting. So in phase 1, the constraints are not budgetary, they're not fiscal. It's physical constraints and non-fiscal measures dominate. It's basically whether we lock down or not. How much we can do for hospitals, we can do a bit. How much we can do to mobilize people, we can do a bit, but that's basically it. I think the interesting question from that point of view is phase 2, which, providing incentives so that in phase 2, we have enough tests, we explore new drugs, or we explore now new drugs we can use then, and we develop vaccines that we can use. And I think there is it's obviously a first order question because the more we can actually develop tests, for example, the less lockdown, the more we can allow firms to go back to it. There are issues as to how you provide incentives to the private sector. And here there's a paper by Michael Kremer, 95 paper, which I liked very much at the time, but turns out to be the more relevant today. And it's fairly clear, I think, that the state should be very involved in basically promising a lump of money to whoever is going to develop something and then distribute it using non-price criteria to the population. That's an issue which I'll come back to because it's not just an issue at the US level, it's an issue at the world level. But I was fascinated by the computation by Paul Romer. I basically wrote these numbers down. I asked him to confirm them. He did not confirm, so take this as what my understanding of what he said. But basically his argument was if we can test enough of the population, then we can actually get R0 celebrated are not the number of people who are likely to be infected by one person, below 1, without any confinement measures. The issue is that the ratio which he suggested was needed was 7% of the population. So this is daily test of 7% of the population. That's 22 million a day just for the US. He then argued, but I think it's really, unless he knows more than I think he knows, it's a seat of a pants computational number. He said, well, maybe we can get there by investing about 200 billion between now and later this year. And so I made the following additional computation. The current cost of a virus test is $50 about. An antibody test is cheaper, $10. Assume that the cost goes down from 50 to 25. I mean, there must be enough economies of scale here. And so the daily cost of actually, if it were doable, the daily cost of doing it, apart from the initial fixed cost, would be about 0.6 billion a day. Now, if you see this as a way to get people to go back to work, then conceivably it might allow for an increase in output of 20%. And an output of 20% higher is basically 10 billion a day. So it is insane, but it says that whatever we can do in that direction is probably worth a whole lot. Again, the next set of points say, where are we compared to this 22 million? And we know we're close. We're probably at 100th of what's needed. So far, if you take the total test in the US, 1.2 million. But I think that's something where fiscal policy can help. It's not expensive by macro standards. If you did all the things that we should do, including that, you still get much less than 1% of GDP, which these days is a small number. So I think there is a challenge to us there's a challenge to the firms to produce it, but to us to say how far to go in that direction, to think about the trade-off. Okay, disaster relief. So the idea is that we need to provide funds to liquidity-constrained households and liquidity-constrained firms, and households who basically don't have the cash to buy food for the next month if they don't get a check, and firms which were at the limit, and if they don't get any revenues, will go belly up. And there we've all understood that the challenge is the trade-off between speed and targeting, which is you'd like to give it just to the right people and to the right firms, but if you did this, it would take years, and by then the firms would have gone bankrupt and the people would be dead. So initially, the targeting was very poor. I think we have to take into account in thinking about what we do next, that it can be done better and better over time. So it would be stupid to continue to do it the same way as we started. We basically have to find better and better ways. So we should think of what has been put in place as bridge programs rather than definitive ones. Different approaches, and they're interesting. And at some stage, somebody will have all the data to actually compare them. In the US, the attitude has been to let firms lay off people, and then they go to the unemployment office and they register, and to send checks to a very large number of people, and to give tax breaks to a very large number of firms and people. In France, the attitude has been very different. Basically, the state has said, well, who knows the employees better than anybody else? The firms. So have the firms continue to pay the workers, but we'll pay you back, right? The banks basically will advance the money if you need it. So basically you can get credit, no questions asked, to cover what you have to spend. And if the banks themselves are in trouble, or for the credit that they extended for those purposes, there'll be a fiscal backstop. And then in addition, there has been a number of tax breaks. This, I think, is slightly better in the sense that it keeps the link between the firm and the workers, and it may make it easier to go back to work when we relax confinement. In the end, when you look closely, the programs are not very different. In the US, for example, but there is some incentives given to firms to actually keep workers rather than put them in the unemployment office. Some of the conditions with the Small Business Association, administration, sorry, loan, takes that form. But still, in the end, I think there are better ways and worse ways of doing it. The next point is that if you do this, type 1 and type 2 are very different. I mean, basically, you want to err on the generous side without any question. So in the US, cash payments to many people who really don't need it. The replacement rate of wages in France is basically if you keep your worker, but it doesn't work. So chômage partiel, it's called in France. He or she gets 80% of its old wage, which is very high, and has led some people to take leisure rather than possibly work. But you have to do this, so it costs money. Should you do grants or should you do loans? These programs in practice have a mix of the two. There was this idea that maybe it would be assessed ex post, depending on whether it was really needed or not. I think that's incredibly dangerous ex ante, because if you don't know, you're going to assume it's a loan, and it's not going to have the same effect. And for some people, it's just not enough. Again, I think on this we can do much better, and I hope that we do as the year passes. The last point on that slide is computation of the cost, and I think that's an important computation. So the first stage is to basically make an assumption about the decrease in output for 2020, and we now have a few numbers. I mean, the INSEE in France had the guts to actually produce a nowcast estimate of GDP for March, and it was 35% below the usual baseline, where it would have been absent the crisis. If you use that number, you assume that there are 2 months of lockdown, and then we slowly go back to no lockdown at the end of the year. So you have 6 months of half lockdown on average. You take this gives you a reduction in output. You assume that the liquidity constrained people and firms are 40%. From what we know, that seems to be a good ballpark number. You replace 80% of their revenues. You do this in the form of grants, so it's money spent. That's actually 5% of GDP. Now, that's a very large number, but it's much smaller than some of the programs which have been offered. I suspect that what happens is many of the programs probably have a grant element, which is of the order of 5%, but some of the loan element is added to it. So I think that's the kind of number we should have in mind. Let me move to the third. So I think on control of aggregate demand, I think that's a very important issue, and starting to see papers which actually deal with it in an interesting way. It's very important to distinguish between phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1, basically, what happens is determined by potential output. Now, in general, we think we can go above potential output, but this is a case in which we cannot. If a firm is closed, there is no way it will produce more. So we have to think about potential output. And then the issue is, well, if we try to keep demand very high or closer to what it would have been absent the crisis, then that's not going to be so good. And then this raises the question of whether the disaster relief, which you saw in the previous slide, actually lead to too much demand. And I think the answer is it could well. Is it something to worry about? I don't think so, because what's going to happen is, if you think about who is going to get the money, if you think about the households, they are probably to spend it on food. There is no big supply constraint there. They are going to repay the mortgage. That's not an issue either. And even if there is rationing or maybe some inflation, and we're seeing on masks and various other products, right? It is not a major issue. Rationing is not the end of the world. And some inflation at this stage actually would not hurt. I think it would be a rather good thing. So it may be that we're just spending too much from that point of view, but it's not the end of the world. The point is we should probably not do more. Now, phase 2, which starts sometime in the summer, is where we have to think harder. Okay, so the question is, as lockdown is relaxed, I mean, when people go back to work at some rate, will private demand go up or down, and will it go up or down faster, or up faster than potential output? And I think we don't know. My best guess is there'll be pent-up demand. If you haven't been able to buy a car, then you'll buy it. And at the beginning, maybe July, August, we'll see some of that. But in general, I suspect that looking at the whole year, the fact that confinement will continue, that there'll be uncertainty, is going to lead to high saving and no investment. And so I have a sense that there will probably be a need for aggregate demand boost, but I wouldn't want to do anything now which basically commits myself or commits the government to do it. So just to remark, I'm very much in favor of public investment. I've argued for it for the last year, but this is not exactly the type of program that you want to start now, because once you start it, you can't stop it. You need something else. And I think that keeping flexibility for the second half of the year is of the essence. So these are the 3 points. And then.
So Olivier, can I ask a quick question?
Please do.
If you have flare-ups all the time, does the analysis change? Do you want to intervene on each flare-up as well in terms of demand management, or?
So if you have what?
So far you talked very much, you know, we have this huge lockdown and then we get out of this lockdown, relax it. But let's suppose we have partial lockdown subsequently,
right,
as the health crisis becomes more severe again. Would you then stimulate demand whenever the lockdown is?
It's an interesting question, because I agree with you that the return to all potential is not going to be smooth. And we're already seeing it in various places. So people had drawn W's, right, as a way rather than V or U's. And I think that we'll have to be nimble on the virus side, which is we establish some lockdown where it looks like it's needed. And I think this has a counterpart for demand policy. And the question is, can we do it? I would hope that, you know, by the second half of the year, the IRS can actually send checks to everybody quickly, something like that. And then we can think of kind of, you know, playing it by ear. But it's clear that, you know, if we have to go back to lockdown, we have to go back to giving checks to some people. So yes, I think there's a very interesting connection here. Okay, I go on. Okay, so by the way, 3 slides left in case people want to know how long this is going to go. The issue, so we get close to the question. The next few slides deal with the question that Markus has raised. So is that sustainable? Now, if a crisis leads, you know, the numbers I've given you, the crisis could lead to increases in debt of 10–15% maybe. But suppose it's much bigger for whatever reason, 30 to 40% of GDP. And my sense is yes, unless basically we've lost the war against the virus, we can sustain levels of debt of you know, more than 100% and probably 150%, 160% for Italy without much trouble. And the argument is the argument that I made, you know, now a year and a half ago in my presidential address, which is R is very low and is less than G. Now I've realized I now have competition for the R's. There are now 2 R's. There is the R naught of a virus strain, and then there is the R star, and I don't know who will win. Anyway, the one that I know something about, or think I know something about, is R star. And, you know, it was low before the virus. It was expected to be very low. Yield curves were incredibly flat, close to 0. To me, there is little question that precautionary saving, if anything, will be bigger. Then investment, private investment, is not going to be higher. So my sense is R star is going to remain very low. Now, the next point is a point that I think Markus raised, which is, well, yeah, but public debt will be higher. And we know that public debt increases R star. And so I think we actually have no clue as to how much public debt increasing R star, but the estimates in the literature are 2 to 4 basis points for 1% debt to GDP. Now, if you believe this, then that would give you an increase in R star of 60 basis points to 160, depending on, you know, the increase in the debt to ratio and the range of increases in basis points. Now, that actually still says that R will be closer to G, but not much higher in any case. And that still makes, in my book, in my computations, that sustainable. The other way it could fail is if we think that growth will be much lower, and surely this year, but after that, And I see no reason to think that potential output growth is going to be very different. So I'm very optimistic about the fact that if we do things right, that is sustainable in advanced economies. Okay. Now we get to, I think.
Can I just intervene about? Can you say a little bit more about the G? Of course, it's a small G. It's not government expenditure.
No, it's
a growth rate.
It's uppercase just to be polite because I've used uppercase R. But yes, it's not G. It's growth, right?
Yes. But is the benchmark not that if you don't intervene, that G might be in the long run much lower? So if we intervene very aggressively now, it might be that we maintain businesses and have a higher growth rate compared to not intervening. So what's the right benchmark in terms of?
There's this paper again on the pandemic, which says if you basically just let the thing just go wild, you're going to have long-run effects on G. I'm assuming that's not what we're going to do, and that by sometime next year, we can go back to the all potential output growth path. And I see no reason to think that technological progress will be very different in the past than in the future in terms of magnitudes. But, we have to think about this, but to me, there's nothing obvious. So this is the slide which is closest to the things that Markus had mentioned. So there's a lot of discussion about monetization of deficits, and I think it's largely confused, and it's related to what we've discussed in the previous slide. Some people say, oh, but deficits are going to monetize, it's the end of the world. The first point to make is monetization when the interest rate is zero, basically to a first order has no effect. And you have two assets, one called debt, which pays zero, and one which is called money, which pays zero. And doesn't much matter how much you change it. I said to a first order, we'll understand about imperfect substability and so on, but to a first order, it doesn't matter. What really matters is what the central banks will do when the neutral rate, R star, will have to increase. I don't know when this is. Maybe 2 years from now, maybe 3 years from now, maybe 10 years from now. But at some stage, we'll want positive rates on economic grounds. And then the question will be, do we basically pay interest on money? If we pay interest on money, then it's just like if you had debt. It doesn't make any difference. You have two assets. One is called debt, the other is called money. They both pay interest to the end. The issue is, and there's some probability that the central banks feel that they cannot pay interest on money then, and they keep the interest rate at zero, while the required interest rate would be positive, and then you get overheating, and eventually you get inflation, and maybe you even get hyperinflation. That is a very remote possibility, but that's a question. So monetization today really doesn't do anything. What's important is what's the probability that when central banks have to increase the rate, they will basically pay interest on money or not. That's half of what I want to say on this. The other half is on the role of the central bank to avoid multiple equilibria. And here, we know that in these markets, there are typically or often two equilibria, a good one. You believe that that is safe, and therefore you charge the safe rate, and that is safe. And then there's another one in which the investors worry. They ask for a spread, the rate is higher, the debt service is higher, that becomes unsustainable, and it's perfectly consistent with rational expectations. Now, what we want to do clearly is avoid the bad equilibrium, right? And that's where these things called yield curve control by the Bank of Japan and have a few other names are needed, which is basically a commitment by the central bank to say, we'll basically keep the good equilibrium. And I think that's basically what the ECB has done. I would have preferred yield curve control, which is a commitment, but what they have done is good enough. That's a risky strategy, because if I'm wrong and that is really not sustainable, then at some stage the central bank will have to give up and accept the fact that the good equilibrium is not so good. But for the moment, that's clearly the thing to do. So my point is that is sustainable in advanced economies. Central banks have to help. Now, last two slides. Next to last slide. and then last slide. Back to emerging markets and developing economies. And I think there the story is different and very sad. Similarities with advanced economies, they fight the same virus. They should have the same goals for fiscal policy, but the differences are fairly obvious. They are just not equipped to fight the virus. I've talked about this. So the dynamics of the infection are going to be very different, with high numbers of deaths is my guess. And then they get the rest, which is they are getting large capital outflows, due not so much to fears about what's happening there, but the investors need the liquidity at home. We've seen this in the great financial crisis. They have a lot of FX-dominated debt, and when there is depreciation, it becomes very costly. They have a much steeper demand curve for government bonds, which if they need to have fiscal deficits is going to cost them. They are suffering from a drop in commodity prices, the disappearance of tourism. So it's very tough. Okay, so they have much more limited fiscal space. Very likely existing debt will have become unsustainable in a number of countries. And then additional borrowing is just going to be very hard to get. So I think for those, there is a liquidity issue which we have to deal with now. And there's an enormous solvency issue which we have to deal with now, but act soon about. Okay. Sorry, this was the last slide, next to last. Good. The role of central banks and international institutions, what I want to say here, I'm not going to go through the details, is that there's an enormous need for liquidity. The debt service for 2008, we don't have a number for 2009 yet, is 3.6 trillion, which may potentially get out of these countries. The outflows just in March were 100 billion. But potentially, all this could actually go out and not want to go back in. And so there has to be provision of liquidity. There are various ways of doing it. My sense is swap lines and probably capital controls on outflows. That's a discussion we can have. The virus should be financed through grants, not regular loans. And here again, there is progress, IDA at the World Bank, various programs at the IMF. SDR allocations where the rich countries give their allocation to the poor countries would be one way. The point here is that the numbers are very large and we're not there yet. Then dealing with the medium run, basically I think that many countries are bankrupt. We don't know yet, so I don't think I would want to basically do a debt restructuring now. I don't think anyway we have the human capital to do it. So I would do standstills. This raises a whole set of issues which many people are working on at this point, but something like this will have to happen. Okay, then last slide. Role of coordination in general. So coordination in mobilizing, getting funds to the emerging markets and developing economies. This I've just talked about. It's much more than coordination, it's giving. You have to coordinate large amounts. Coordination about sharing information about pandemics and fiscal measures, and that's motherhood and apple pie, but it's a bit more than that because, again, we've never seen it before. We're taking measures we've never taken before. So sharing information is actually essential. Coordination in determining the size of fiscal programs, I don't think that's obvious. And the usual argument is an aggregate demand argument, which is because of spillovers and the fact that when you spend, other countries will benefit and not you, I think is irrelevant at this point. If you think about infection fighting and disaster relief, you basically don't care. You do it for yourself, and that's good enough. The last point is something that worries me a lot, which I've put there because I think there's a need for coordination. You're starting to see it with the fighting for masks and the stories about the US going on the tarmac and stealing masks from the French in China. But this is just anecdotal. But basically, we're not going to have enough tests and enough vaccines anytime soon. And if we let the markets decide, then what's going to happen is the rich countries will get it. And within the rich countries, the rich people will get it. And that is not the way it should go. And it's going to be ugly. And therefore, I think we have to think of agreements to subsidize research I talked about it earlier, and then allocate across countries according to needs, not means. As I say in the last slide, highly desirable, highly unlikely. Maybe it can be done at the level of the EU, maybe not. If it's not done, my guess is that this will be in the news and will have geopolitical implications in the fall. Thank you very much. I stop here, take questions. Markus, you're in charge.
Thanks, Olivier. Fantastic talk and a nice overview over all the aspects of the fiscal side. So let me group the questions a little bit together. The first block I would like to put together is some monetary questions. So Astrid Dörner and Evangelos from University of Thessaloniki asks, to what extent do we live? What are your thoughts to MMT in this context? Then there are questions about helicopter money. Are we doing helicopter money? And Yao Zheng asks, are the boundaries between fiscal and monetary policies blurred, that given that now both authorities work so closely together? And do we have to think about these things? And Philippos Petrodlos asks about, do all these programs create some additional demand, which are done too much demand in order, lead them to inflationary pressure? So that's all pointing essentially in the same direction, all pointing to, aggressive intervention by the government and the coordination between fiscal and monetary authorities, and then the connection to the MMT as well.
Okay. MMT is right in one case, which is when the interest rate is equal to 0. Then basically it doesn't matter whether you finance by money, you finance by debt. So if you feel like financing by money, please do it. So I discussed it there. MMT, I think, is wrong when the interest rate is positive, and then there's a difference. Then I don't think it's necessarily wise to finance deficits by money then. But right now, I think we can all agree that basically, deficits can be financed indirectly by the central banks buying bonds and issuing money, but can be financed by money. It doesn't much matter. I agree with the second point, which is I think the separation between fiscal and monetary is becoming fuzzier and fuzzier. And basically what I argued there is that from a fiscal point of view, that is sustainable. But if the central bank doesn't make sure that there is no sudden stop, it may actually not be. And so there you have basically the need for both to work together. I still think that there's ways of separating conceptually one from the other, but they clearly have to work together. That's for sure. And then on the too much demand, that's a point that I think I had made. Yeah, and basically this is a case where right now, say this month, March or April, the non-essential firms are not producing, right? There's no way around that. The goods are just not produced. Now, if you increase demand to try to have it at the level at which it was last year in March or April, and then you're going to, or April or May, March or April, you're going to find that there is rationing because it's just the goods are just not there, and you're going to get some inflation. Now, again, rationing may not be catastrophic because, when there is rationing, instead of going to the people who can most afford it, it goes to the people who can stand in line longer, and these tend to be poor people. So I actually have no problem with that. But inflation in that context is going to be for some goods, not for others. I actually see deflation, for example, in the price of takeouts at this point, because some restaurants are desperate. They basically are trying to get takeouts, and they are basically offering good prices. So, but if there is inflation overall, so what? It's actually quite good. It reduces the real interest rate. Probably will not last. Fine with me.
So the next block is about emerging economies. So I put them together. So the first question comes from Nicholas Rapanos, who wants to know about the emerging markets. And they're mostly affected by the global demand, and then it comes in staggered fashions. How do we take care of this? That the lockdowns is not everywhere around the globe at the same time. So, but your demand essentially is collapsing. And then there's some questions concerning about lockdowns in more general, whether the lockdown approach, which we use in the West, is this the right thing for emerging economies? So John Jeff Reddy from the New School asks, Are the cost-benefit analysis is the same we should use also for the developing economy, or is this a different cost-benefit analysis? And finally, Sajantan Chaudhary asks about what are the implications for the foreign exchange market and exchange rates, whether you could illuminate your thoughts on the foreign exchange markets, what the implications for the international currency markets are.
Can you repeat the last question?
The last question is about the dynamics on the exchange rates. What do you foresee there, and how will it play out? How will it affect the local firms if suddenly the exchange rate weakens dramatically, flight to safety phenomena come kicking in? How do you see the whole thing playing out on the emerging economies? Do you see a lot of differentiation across different emerging economies, or do you see all of them will be hit simultaneously the same way, or would you differentiate between different countries in the emerging world?
Okay, so for emerging market and developing economies, what are they affected by most? And it depends. I mean, the thing which is not affecting them from an economic point of view yet on any substantial scale is actually the virus, because they haven't been able to basically just do much about it. But they are affected by all the things that, by all the other things, which is exports, clearly, which are collapsing. Commodity prices, which are collapsing. The oil price war for the oil exporters is really an unneeded addition to the woes that they have. The capital outflows, now again, it varies across countries, but this is affecting them very much, leading to very large depreciations in a number of countries. So yeah, I mean, they basically are facing, perfect storm, I think, is a combination of three things. I think they're facing a 4 or 5 things perfect storm. But the combination of shocks is different across countries. On the lockdown, no, I think that, if the African countries could do the same thing, which is a very intense lockdown at the beginning, and in a way they at the beginning of it, it would work, except that I think the evidence is that they really cannot do the lockdown. You cannot do the lockdown in a slum of 1 million people, or in some of the major cities in Africa. I think it's just impossible. So if you believe it's impossible, then there are going to be a lot of cases, and they are not going to have the means to treat them by a long shot. And so I think that the dynamics will be quite different. So yes, I think we should hope for lockdowns, but it's probably not the optimal strategy. It may be that the optimal strategy is to basically let the virus, have the infection rate decline more slowly with a larger cost, human cost. Now, is this due to a difference in welfare functions across advanced economies and the others? Surely not. It's the same welfare function, which is that we care enormously about lives, but the trade-offs are different, and therefore the outcomes may be quite different. But we should care about lives as much in Africa as we do in the US. And then on the dynamics of the exchange rate, what we've seen, I mean, it's quite fascinating what has happened, is that the exchange rate between reserve currencies hasn't moved much. It went up and down between the euro and the dollar, but basically it has more or less where it was. But if you look at emerging markets, there has been very large depreciations, and that reflects the combination of capital outflows and the lack of use of capital controls. And that worries me a bit. Letting the exchange rate do that, creates problems in terms of FX debt. It becomes much more expensive. It also allows, the private creditors to get out before the official creditors start putting money in. And that's why I think that the issue of capital controls on the outflows, I've always been in favor of capital controls on the short run inflows. Capital controls on outflows should be exceptional. This is an exceptional circumstance. I don't want to see what I saw in Argentina, which is basically, IMF money allowing basically private investors to get out rather than helping Argentina. I don't want to see that This means that I think that capital controls really are, in this exceptional circumstance, the right thing to do.
Can I just eject one more question, which came from the emerging economies? William Bartow is asking, and he's not from the emerging economy, but he wanted to know more about the remittance because he thinks, they're 10% of GDP and they might collapse as well. How important are the remittance payments? Do you have a take on that?
No, I have a take that I should have mentioned it, and I'm happy that that Willem did it. You add this to the list.
So the next block of questions are more about Europe, and there's a number of questions about Corona bonds, Euro bonds, debt mutualization. How do you see the European situation playing out? Do we need a permanent restructuring? Should we use the current crisis to push the Euro bonds through, or is it more like you get a special purpose vehicle within the European Investment Bank which deals with this particular crisis? Or do you think that's also the time now to change the whole framework in Europe as well?
That's a very interesting debate. I think that the difference in positions comes from differences in beliefs about debt sustainability, namely that what I've called the good equilibrium can really be sustained. If you think, as I do, that debt is essentially sustainable, then the yield curve control, which I talked about, are basically kind of having the ECB do the job by itself is okay, right? Because it just, that is sustainable, and the role of the ECB is just to intervene to make sure it remains. That's fine. I suspect that I may be a bit optimistic and that the good equilibrium may not be so good, and that in this case, there is a genuine issue as to whether there should be something more done, helping Italy basically kind of spend as much as it needs without getting into trouble. If you think that is maybe not sustainable, then the ECB is a band-aid, not a solution. And then you really have to think of other ways. And then there are two ways, as you and I know very well. There is the ESM and the OMT, which is basically a program, European program, which basically would make sure that that is sustainable by basically forcing Italy to do a few things, maybe. That's one way. And then the best way, obviously, because the risk sharing is the most obvious, is Euro bonds or Corona bonds or whatever you want. You've created a whole set of possibilities in the last few years, but anything which basically shares risk. But there we know that the issue is the reluctance of some countries to share risk. Is this something which should be pushed now? Yes, I absolutely think so. I think that in times of crisis, you get things through that you would not have gotten otherwise. I think the idea of the Corona bonds, which suggests that this is a one-time thing, is a very nice way of pushing it. Once it has been done once, it can be done again, but at least it smells like a one-time thing. That might be acceptable. So bottom line, I'm happy that the ECB did what it did. I would have liked it to do more, but its mandate doesn't allow it to do more. I have no objection to ESM OMT with very light conditionality. Basically, use the money to fight the virus and the economic consequences of the virus, not to reduce the retirement age. And then pushing for Corona bonds at the same time. And maybe we see a combination of all three. You're welcome to come in, Markus, because this is something on which you have worked 10 times more than I have.
Yes, so I will come in at some point, but we're running out of time, and there are a lot of questions coming up. So Francesco Papadia asked about inflation expectations. So he's worried, given that certain prices are going up already, do you see actually a de-anchoring of inflation expectations, or is this a fear? And then there's some questions about debt relief. So especially for the emerging economies, if you have to restructure debt, there's a lot of Chinese debt outstanding. Asker Torfas ask about debt relief, but there's Chinese debt treated because they're not part of the Paris Club. Is this a concern, especially for emerging economies? And do you see any solution on this? And should international organizations push more to get some coordination on this side, which I think you mentioned already in the talk, but also on this dimension?
Okay, on inflation expectations, no, I'm not worried that they'll be de-anchored. Again, I'm not sure that we may see inflation for a number of items, but I'd be surprised if we saw major inflation. I think people will understand that that's just a very short-term thing. I don't think it will destabilize expectations. I'm more worried about if we don't do enough with aggregate demand and it's needed later, that we go back to deflation, and that would worry me more. Debt relief, again, what I've said is maybe we can have a first step in which we have a standstill and then see whether that needs to be restructured or reduced. But even a standstill is an awfully complicated thing to do when you have this mix of official creditors, private creditors, loans to semi-public entities, and so on and so on. So getting agreement may be extremely difficult, and getting agreement quickly may be extremely difficult. And therefore, we may have unilateral defaults, basically countries saying, well, we just don't pay. And then, you come to the table and we discuss it. I would hope it can be done in a slightly more organized fashion, but it may well happen. And if it happens, there's safety in numbers. If you basically have 50 countries which do this, then, you basically have to start taking them seriously. But it's a mess. The solution to this, as you, again, well know, is CACs, right? Basically things which say you basically can restructure, even if not everybody is on board. But most of these bonds still don't have the right CACs, and therefore it cannot be used yet.
So let me end with a final round of questions which deal with small businesses and insolvency risk. The firm debt level, is this not a problem? You mentioned grants being injected. That's of course then helping a lot. But if there's a lot of debt building up on small firms, is this a problem? Should we more inject equity into the small firms or also mid-sized firms? What's your view on that, the capital structure aspects? And then there's some big questions by Astrian, who wants to know the role of trade, migration, and globalization after COVID. Do you see a total change of the global economy, as this crisis unfolds? So essentially, supply chains will be undone, everything will be moved back within national borders, to see a huge departure from the open global society to more retrenchment and more national focused economies.
Okay. Question one on insolvency. I think, again, because of the need to do things very quickly, there was really no other way than just allow firms basically to get loans, no conditions asked, and so on and so on. As time goes, I'd rather do it in a better way. I would basically look at firms more closely. I mean, some firms were probably bankrupt, quasi-bankrupt before. I don't want to help them. And for the firms which are not, it seems to me that taking an equity position is probably a good idea. You can't do this to SMEs. They're just too small, but you can do better. I think that's one of the dimensions in which over time you can do better. But surely taking equity positions turned out to be a very good thing to do in the great financial crisis, and would be again. On migration, immigration, yeah, I think I keep being asked what are going to be the major changes after. And in general, I'm not sure that we're going to change very much individually, but I see deglobalization as something which was already happening on trade wars, security issues, right? And I think it can be reinforced by this. I mean, suppose that Africa remain basically pandemic for a while, then it seems to me that we may well see very strong constraints on immigration from Africa. Africa may be separated from the rest of the world for a while. So yes, I worry very much about that. That might be one of the legacies, at least for a while.
Can we end on a positive note, given all the challenges we have? There are some questions which say, oh, don't you see also big technological breakthroughs coming up? Now we're using the Zoom software, doing telemedicine. We can do anywhere in the world. So it might be on the service side, there might be more remote interaction and distance matter perhaps less. Where do you see the big technological breakthroughs coming from the Corona crisis and also alerting us against other problems we totally underestimated earlier? It might have some positive side effects, just to have some positive ending for the great interview. And I thank you a lot for doing it. I think it shows that we are running over time, but people are still here. And perhaps you can give us the positive outlook, the positive aspects in the long run.
Zoom is good. I hope they hear us and they reduce the price that they charge. No, it's clear that we're going to travel less and use Zoom more, because we're discovering it's actually a nice technology. It's not perfect, but it's good. I think it may change higher education, may make basically kind of distance learning much more attractive. I think it may lead to much more telecommuting. We have understood that we can do it from home. Yesterday I had a call with Philip Lane, our common friend, and he was in Dublin. Now it's interesting that the chief economist of the ECB would be in Dublin, but in fact, it was just as efficient for him to be there than to be in Frankfurt. I think these things are going to change. Whether we're going to be different human beings, I'm more skeptical.
Good. So that's also positive that we stay the same in our good sides, at least. And again, thanks a lot for being with us. We very much appreciate it. And we stay in touch for sure.
Okay.
Thanks, Olivier.
Thanks. Bye.